Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Bavarian, and today we're going to talk about where I was and what I did. I was in Stockholm over the last couple of days. Shout out, by the way, to the fella that recognized me. I thought you wanted to talk to Lathan. When you didn't, I was like, alright, we gotta get out of here. Sorry about that, of course. But essentially, we were at Paradox. We spent some time with the devs. We talked about the game with them quite a lot as well. And there was a presentation where they talked about the future of National Awakening here, right? So of Victoria 3 in that regard. And we got a lot of information that hasn't been released, that hasn't been talked about at all. I'm sure that this will be covered later on, but for me this was actually really good insight. There was a lot coming in there because, man, I am glad with this immersion pack, or rather I'm happy about it, which is something that I didn't expect, because ultimately I expected almost exclusively the narrative side, but what they have right here actually comes with a ton of stuff that will impact your game, even outside of the bespoke content that comes for certain countries. In this video, I'm going to talk about all of that. I have chapters down there. You can see a time lapse in the background, you know, just to keep your ADHD in check out. Now, obviously, what they did talk about, it was a lot, and I have sorted it. Let's start with the one that we're going to skip over, that is cultural fervor, because we've already talked about it. I really like the way this works. I like the idea. I like the implementation. Let's hope that it is balanced, but fundamentally, I would argue that this is a really interesting slant towards nationalism as you build your identity. The only kind of cherry on top that I would want from it is, I guess, being able to have building blocks for what your nationalism looks like. This isn't really what that mechanic employs to do there, but the way that nationalism is constructed is really interesting, and I would like to dive into it. The most interesting part, of course, is the modern Hellenism, right? The modern Greek nationalism compared to people that at the time suggested that one would return to the Eastern Roman Empire identity, or rather stick with it, I guess, because they did call themselves, of course, Romaion even at that time. But the idea here is it is really interesting, and I would like to explore this. Now, let's skip that though, because again, there is nothing new there. We already know everything that there is to know. Let's talk about Springtime of the People Rework. This one is something that I didn't have on the radar. It makes a lot of sense because that was a time of liberalism, it was a time of nationalism, and this is actually really cool. What they've done there is almost exactly what I was hoping for on that, on the level of scope that we are at with an immersion pack. So this is the free patch. So this is not locked behind any paywall or anything. Neither is Cultural Fervor, of course. Springtime of the Peoples is, if you don't know the history of it, of course, in 1848, 1849, the peoples of Europe, many peoples of Europe anyway, rebelled against the system Metternich. They were in a position where they were saying, we are now both nationalistic, so we have an understanding of, who is part of our community, what is or what should be one country. We are trying to claim a nation for that, so a state for that, and of course we are also looking for liberal reforms because that is incredibly important to us. Both of these came to, essentially they exploded in 1848 because they had been suppressed very proactively in the very first system of its kind, I would argue, like this. All over Europe, this is what System Metternich is, what the good old fella built there. And then in 1848, 1849, that came, essentially it exploded, and later on would falter again as well. So 1848, you're looking at republics, you're looking at revolutionary movements kind of conquering Europe. There is a wave coming from France and moving east, and indeed they take over in a whole bunch of states. They even force a German parliament to debate the unification of Germany, but in the end, indeed, the reactionary forces come back and suppress this very same movement. So this is the period right there. This is content that is already present in Victoria 3, but it doesn't quite work. It starts in a couple of countries and then never really moves through Europe. Like, the way that it is described historically and that it is understood as historically really isn't the way that it plays out here. So let's just skip over the current implementation and talk about what they did there, because that is really nice. When a country has a liberal insurrectionary movement, this will open up this journal entry for all European countries. In short, this is effectively a situation, right? If you think about, for example, EU5 and what we know about situations there as well, this is one of those things that is true for all of the people participating in what is Europe at the time and what is the kind of order in that area. This is good, just fundamentally, I will be honest with you, because that is the only way that you can have an actual chain reaction, that you can have actual threats there kind of going on in all countries, which is, of course, indeed what it was historically. Now, this journal entry apparently changes movement attraction and heavily, does stuff like making pops more willing to join a movement, they radicalize faster, yada, yada, yada. When you are in a position where this movement is successful, so for example, I believe the exact wording I'm kind of no longer, I can't remember time. I'm not privy to it. It's somewhere in my mind, but I can't quite remember. But essentially, when you are successful, so for example, you're passing Republic and then that goes through, and I believe there's even an event that already existed in the existing content, right, where you can just immediately turn into a Republic. When this happens, this will embolden liberal movements in your neighboring countries. So we are now talking about a wave as well. The idea of this seems to be that France is the most likely to start this because they are the least stable because of divided monarchists, and they are in a position where divided monarchists makes it so that France is very likely to collapse into a republic as is. This is exactly matching something that was also on Metternich's mind when he was discussing European politics. He was, in fact, by the way, forced out in 1848-49. That is when he retired because people didn't like him very much because of, again, everything that I said previously. But he said that when France coughs, all of Europe catches a cold. So this exact sentiment, this dynamic is kind of present here as well. There's something really cool here beyond this, and that is that even when the liberal kind of movement succeeds and you liberalize either by becoming a constitutional monarchy or by becoming a republic, there is content from the way that I understood it to kind of the reactionaries lashing out yet again, right? Because they are saying, no, we're taking it back. This is literally what happened, right? Of course, in Prussia, for example, the king promised rights, yada, 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 when the barricades were up. And then later on he crushed this yet again. This was essentially the way it went in most of Germany and most of Europe in general. The interesting part there is indeed that we could see this kind of flip-flopping that did happen historically. It's really cool. What isn't cool, and this is the last part about Springtime of the Peoples, is that there is no gutter crown, there is no Frankfurt Parliament. Now, I do want to add, this is a free rework. This is just kind of done by the site because, of course, it fits the theme and it fits what this update is all about. But yeah, no gutter crown, that isn't happening just yet. Although, of course, the devs did say that, yep, that is on their radar. They really do like the gutter crown. One day, that may be something that they're doing. This is really cool. I really like the content coming there for Springtime of the Peoples. I have missed it dearly. I've tried to mod it as well, but much like secession movements, Springtime of the Peoples, the way it was kind of, I think, unrecoverable. So what they're doing here now is very much something that makes me happy. Beyond this and away from this, we have a new law category. And I wasn't privy to this at all. I don't think I had seen this in any of the footage. I'm going to gather the footage that I'm going to put on screen here later. But basically, they now will have labor union laws. Labor union laws, if you have played Victoria 2, they already had them there, of course, but they were different in the effect. And I really like the kind of vector that they're doing of these laws right here. Having another law category is always a balancing risk, because what it means is that you are going to be busy passing laws that previously didn't exist, which means your entire kind of playthrough is now in a different order, and the way it plays out is just no longer paced the exact same way that it was before. The way it starts off is that if you are very reactionary, let's talk about Russia, for example, you will end up with guilds. These guilds are very strict, of course, and have a really interesting impact. I have to assume that they essentially keep any type of popular socialist movement, from ever reaching you, but they also have the impact of hindering social mobility. And that is genuinely really, really cool. I like the way this works, because what it means is in Russia, if you play it right now, you are really unlikely to ever run into qualification issues. You will almost always find somebody to be able to work in this location. Gearing up, making sure that your buildings are filled, that your officer corps, for example, are able to recruit correctly, is easy even before you open up Russia. Now it should be harder. I really like this. It means that it is easier, at least the way that I anticipate this feature, it is easier to remain very reactionary, to remain absolutist as Russia, but it also means that there now are much, much stronger drawbacks, which I think is a really good, a really interesting trade-off. I like what they're doing there. I think that is cool. Beyond this, the rest of the kind of labor union laws are kind of geared towards, the two-way movement right here. It's a two-way street when it comes to the benefits and the drawback. If you are more liberal on your laws, so there are labor unions, they're allowed in general, and then you of course have state-controlled labor unions. I would assume that there's also something like no socialist labor unions. That was of course something that was in Wiki 2 as well, and was historically a thing, of course. But basically the idea is, when you become more open about who can exist, the socialist movement loses the steam, there's less suppression. It will naturally mean that they are kind of defanging themselves, more likely that they are social democrats, that kind of stuff. But it also means that then those social democrats get a boost to their strength. So that means, yes, the extremely radical ones are gone, but realistically speaking, you're looking at a stronger set of people that are still demanding labor laws and so on. So there will be concessions there. It is essentially the historical kind of path that Germany in particular, of course, took when it came to this, with the Sozialistengesetze, the making the SPD illegal and so on. The movement itself had more radical offsprings right there. Really cool, I like it, and again, it makes it so that it essentially de-radicalizes the socialist movement, but it may well strengthen the trade unions in general, so the interest group itself. And of course, we're looking at worse countries, reactionary countries now, actually struggling with qualifications. At least that is the hope. Something else that I do also want to mention, very unrelated, is that there was an East Africa rework. We are now looking at the entire East Coast, so that includes Kenya, being in centralized countries' hands. I can't quite recall, I swear. So this was essentially a project done in the personal development time, which means it is something the developer did in their own kind of, hey, you get to work on whatever project you want to work on. And I think there is some Oman content there, but honestly, I'm not too certain. That may well be untrue. I wouldn't want to put my hand in the fire for this one. But anyway, really good news for me, because it means that Kenya is no longer colonizable just by existing. You have to go into a diploplay, which means people that do that can be stopped. It is nicer for multiplayer. You don't need a gentleman's agreement anymore not to colonize this until X or Y, just because it's kind of silly if you have those colonies right away. Instead, it is something that you have to, of course, as great powers play over. I really like it. Now then, after that, we started talking about we started hearing, I should say, about the actual content for National Awakening in, the DLC. So obviously the countries that are getting the charge of the content right here are Austria, it is Hungary, it is Serbia, it is Montenegro, Bulgaria, Greece, and the Ottomans. Although I think Greece and the Ottomans may mostly be, and that might even be in the free game, something that has been altered, so the existing content there already. Wouldn't want to put my hand in the fire there either, but I can tell you, for example, that Bavarocracy, which is the rule of King Otto, of course, has seen some changes. Changes have been made right there. So essentially they folded Byzantium into that entire context, right? The content of the Greek nationalism and fervor and so on, and then indeed also the King Otto. So there's a new content there. I really like that. I want to play that, of course, but the more bespoke content is something else. We're talking about, for example, Austria, and that screenshot, I really liked it. We already talked about it quite a bit. The Age of Metternich agenda is an experiment that they're doing. One of the experiments that they're doing, where essentially you have tiered success stages, right? You have various things that you can pursue. You won't probably succeed in all of them, but the better you do, the better will be your reward. They also have traced a lot of the kind of leanings in Austria at the time. We have neo-absolutism that will have dedicated content, so that means restoring entirely a quasi-Russia-like situation, at the time Russia, but also just simply rolling it back even further than where they are already, restoring supremacy to or of the Kaiser, and of course making it so that everybody is a subject of the Kaiser, and that defines their existence, no questions asked. There's also trialism and the federal solution. So trialism will lead you down a path where you will try to erect a third crown that then would hopefully make it so that indeed Hungary is kind of, kept in check by a new balance of powers rather than just the dual monarchy. Federal solution would be the United States of Greater Austria. This would be just, a federal system. What can you say? And then last but not least, they have the Ständestaat as well. So the Ständestaat is something that happened in Austria after World War I, but actually was pointed out by Victoria, so one of the developers of Victoria 3, that this kind of movement, that this entire thing was already present. The ideology, the idea was something that developed, I believe, in the 1890s is what I heard there, although I wouldn't know. I just trust that, because they, of course, the team looked that up, and Victoria, she herself was looking into the actual content there directly. The Ständestaat is really cool because I was concerned it is late game content. We're talking about something that happened in Austria after they lost the empire and after they lost the emperor, because they had become a republic, of course, at the time. This sounded to me like it wouldn't be firmly locked behind that type of ordeal, right? So you don't need to fully fall apart to experience Austrofascism, which I think is really cool. Having late game content that isn't impossible to see, always something very nice. I think she was talking about, and I might be misremembering here. I swear to God, it was either neo-absolutism or trialism that will enable you essentially to then also look into the Ständestaat. There's a lot going on there. I'm really looking forward to this, but these kind of guide you politically through the time in Austria. There's one more, and this one is really, really interesting. I need to see this one in action, because this is an experiment that is pretty much out there. It is called Gründerzeit, and the Gründerzeit was a historical period after the unification of Germany that ended in a crash, and the Gründerzeit essentially describes enthusiasm to invest, to spend all of your money, put it into projects, and then have the GDP grow and grow and grow, and it is a shared journal entry for all German countries. The language was, from the north all the way to Austria, so all of them, and this content essentially is contingent on everybody in that area growing to a certain degree, and if they fail to do it, then the delusion of the investor kind of sets in, and you don't actually, you get a crisis, right? But if you succeed, then there's just unbridled enthusiasm. It was really interesting because there is, of course, a discussion to be had there as well. Victoria 3 and, Victoria 3 doesn't really know market actors per se, right? Like, a monopoly in Victoria 3 isn't necessary to be understood in the same way that it is understood in the theory behind a monopoly actor, because, this just describes that you have the complete market, but you don't necessarily, for example, this is just one of the things that can happen under a monopoly, where you would produce less to kind of have a higher price, and that ultimately optimizes your profit, or rather it maximizes your profit, making it so that you have a suboptimal amount of output, but your profit generates the most. That behavior isn't really present, and this crisis is one of those examples as well, right? The Gründerzeit, the Gründerkrach, actually, that's what it's called, I remember from high school lessons very long ago. The Gründerkrach isn't something that we can do, or that Victoria 3 can do, just system-wise, so bespoke content right here to bring that in there is interesting. I was talking to them and they were like, this could be interesting, like looking into actors, but of course it is a little bit underneath the scale of what Victoria 3 does on the level of the national economy. Anyway, I bring it up because that is an experiment, a lot of actors involved there. We have to see what it feels like. We have 2 massive experiments in here for sure, actually 3, maybe more of them even, but essentially we have the idea, of course, of the springtime of the peoples being something that is basically a situation, although it is then handled domestically, unless somebody impacts you from the outside via having a revolution, for example. And then we have the Gründerzeit. We're going to see how that pans out. The Austrian content sounds nice. It is really interesting indeed. Montenegro also gets content, and it's interesting content. So you already have a screenshot right there, and this screenshot right there was also the main focus. That is what most of the other content creators that were there, by the way, great fellas, every single one of them, they were really excited, really interested in this. We already saw this in the trailer for National Awakening, the raiding that Montenegro can do. And essentially the idea is that Montenegro is basically not a state or a country or anything really at the time. It is just a collection of very, very few kind of disparate communities living on a hill, that, to put it bluntly, and they are supplying themselves. They are creating a state budget from raiding, and you can see that right there. You can see how that works. As the Ottomans, you can stop this if you annex or turn them into a tributary, so into a subject. This mechanic comes with an actual interaction, so you choose who you are raiding. It is more flexible, which is really nice, because let's assume you are still Montenegro, but the Ottomans are gone. For some reason, everything is no longer the Ottomans. You can still choose somebody else. Now, this isn't a universalized raiding mechanic. It's not like that actually exists, right? But I can tell you that the content creators that were present there were incredibly excited over this, because obviously that's a really interesting thing that Victoria 3 doesn't do at all. It wasn't really that common in the period, of course, but that is an interesting thing, and I can tell you that the devs definitely heard that. They were like, oh, this looks really interesting. If players find this also interesting as a gameplay dynamic, then I think they are definitely open. They sounded very open to expanding on this, to turn this into a universal mechanic. Montenegro basically relies on this based on the journal entry and then that interaction. It is designed to transition into becoming a nation state, finding a common identity. It can do things like, for example, rejoining Serbia as well. It can manipulate great powers. They didn't specify what that was, and I forgot to ask. It can manipulate them into helping them gain territory, of course, and independence. Really interesting dynamic there as well. Very tiny country. I assume the first years are just you raiding, and then you can hope that something happens there. I will say I specifically have in mind hoping that there will be a boat rework, of course, coming next year, right? I specifically have in mind, for example, the great Chinese pirate age that happened after the Opium Wars, like into the 1840s and such. Those are technically raiding mechanics, if you will, right? There is a lot of raiding that didn't happen, not because people didn't want to, but because nobody would sponsor them. People had agreed not to raid on the sea at all. And there is potential there where you could say, hey, I want to step out of this. I want to step out of that agreement, and I want to go back to raiding. Of course, we have Barbary raiders, for example, the Barbary pirates. So that is the Tunisians, the Algerians, and so on. But the idea kind of is that if there was a world where there isn't a big British bulldog with a big navy that is globally active and says, I will kill you if you raid on the high seas, I could see that happening as well. It would be an interesting mechanic, that's all I'm saying, if you ever have a kind of breakdown of order like that. This sounded interesting. Montenegro, again, will be one of the very differently playing countries, I guess. We also have general Balkan stuff as well. We have the Great Eastern Crisis, and we heard a little bit about Serbia, of course. Serbia is in a position where they have the dynasty struggle. It sounded to me a little bit like the France content for divided monarchists. We also, of course, have Bulgaria that is becoming or wants to become the Prussia of the Balkans, so there is indeed militarization there. Let me think about this. The other thing right here is that we are looking at, what is this? Right, the question of Illyria and Yugoslavia, right? Illyria is what happens when you form it as a Catholic nation. Yugoslavia is what happens when you form it as an Orthodox nation, right? So these are the dynamics right there. Other than that, there is general Balkan content. There's the Great Eastern Crisis. There's the Eastern Question, in which, of course, Russia is encouraged to free Bulgaria, and then we have Austria encouraged to free Bosnia and kind of turn it into a colony, trying to implement their own policies right there, right? National Awakening in itself is also a journal entry that just details you building a nation. And I asked one question that really was kind of on my mind, because we have the Russosphere, right? So that is related to the acceptance of culture within the Russian Empire if they have been a part of the Russian Empire for a long time, and that can be removed if they leave the Russian Empire or if the Russian Empire changes and falls apart and yada yada yada. I was asking whether this is something that can generally happen. Let's say as a German, I annex the Netherlands. Will they eventually, if I were, more feudally organized, would they eventually gain acceptance from the fact that they have been a part of the, the subjecthood kind of citizenship law of Germany? The answer is no. Currently, that is only in the content that it is already in. I believe there was a different... Which one was that? I believe the Ottomans actually have a similar cultural trait. It is Romalian, so because they have been a part of the Romalian subjecthood kind of empire, some cultures are much, much closer and much more accepted to the Turkish culture than they normally would be. So this is something that happens specifically there. Outside of this, I'm looking forward to National Awakening. I'm looking forward to Iberian Twilight. We didn't really learn anything else right there. The Carlist Wars are going to be present, I assume, I wager, right? But essentially, yeah, we're looking at a lot of content coming. This one is coming pretty soon, all things considered. And what they were talking about specifically to Springtime of the Peoples, to the labor union laws, and to the bespoke content, I'm really excited about this. I think this looks like a good DLC. And I would like to encourage you to leave your comments, especially related to labor unions and to Springtime of the Peoples, but then also to raiding. Are you as excited as all the other content creators? Let me know for sure about this. I will leave you right here, and I will see you later, alligator.